Hello there, and welcome to this episode of Just a Few. My name is Patrick Antoine, and as usual, it is my privilege to utilize this platform to provide biblical responses to questions from people just like you. If you have a question and you'd like me to attempt to provide you with an answer, please feel free to submit that question to me, preferably via email. The email address is on the screen. Please submit the question and I'll try to provide you with a response as soon as I can. Today's question has to do with an observation in the Bible, both Old and New Testament, that oftentimes people would have guests and they would kill an animal as large as a cow, a calf, to provide a meal for their guests. And the questioner wants to know if this is real or just figurative usage in biblical cultural expression. So let's jump to the question as it has been condensed. The question is, did people in the Bible use entire cows to serve to guests at meals? And we need to understand that people in biblical times, of course, they lived in a different time and they lived in a different cultural setting than, let's say, we here in the Western world. And by New Testament times, we'll notice that Paul the Apostle, writing to the church at Corinth in 1 Corinthians, he's talking about meats offered to idols and meat sold in the meat market. By that time, at least in the Roman Empire, we see that there were meat markets. But when you go back into ancient times, prior to that, in the Old Testament, we don't see anything mentioned about meat markets. And so that's because people generally raise their own animals and they slaughtered their animals whenever they were ready for meat. Another thing is that in ancient times, there would not have been things like refrigerators or deep freezers to store this meat in. So it means that when you slaughtered an animal, you had to use it all or find some way of preserving it to ensure that it didn't go bad. So keep that in mind. People raised their own meat back then for consumption as families. And you may ask, are they going to eat this entire fatted calf? I mean, a cow is a large animal. So it's a reasonable observation and question. When they did not consume, or what they did not consume after a meal, they would have, let me back up a little bit here, before the meal. Once they slaughtered an animal, they would know how much they required, they were going to use. The rest, they could have bartered it. Bartering is a system by which you have a huge wheat field, you could supply me with 50 pounds of wheat and I will give you 10 pounds of beef. That's bartering, a system that was used in ancient time. Another way to preserve some of the meat is that it could have been salted. That's like how in our culture we have salted fish, salted beef, salted any type of meat, because that's what they use to preserve it. So we see a number of instances. For instance, in the days of Abraham, we go back to Genesis chapter 18 and look at a couple verses there. Genesis 18 verses 7 and 8 says, and Abraham, he had a couple of visitors there in the first 5 or 6 verses, and he ran to the herd, took a tender and good calf, gave it to a young man, and he hastened to prepare it. So he took butter and milk and a calf, which he had prepared, meaning slaughtered and got dressed, as we would say, for cooking, and set it before them. And he stood by them under the tree as they ate. So he had 3 guests, 3 visitors, and they were eating. They served meat. It doesn't mean they served them the entire calf. We go ahead now about 1,000 years later to the days of King Solomon, one of the wealthiest men who ever lived. Now Solomon's provision for one day, I'm reading 1 Kings chapter 4 from verse 22. Now Solomon's provision for one day was 30 cores of fine flour. We're going to go into the modern equivalent and so on. 60 cores of meal, 10 fatted oxen, 20 oxen from the pasture. So they had a place where they were ready to have fattened calf. They don't put them out in the field, enclose them and fatten them. and then the others are out in the field. So he had 10 fatted oxen, 20 oxen from the pastures, and 100 sheep, besides deer, gazelles, roebucks, and fatted fowl. Of course, he didn't eat it all by himself every day. So we go now into the New Testament with the story of what is known as the prodigal son. When he returned, the Bible tells us his father had a feast with all of the servants and friends and so on. Luke 15:22 and 23 says, "But the father said to his servants, 'Bring out the best robe and put it on him, and put a ring on his hand and sandals on his feet, and bring the fatted calf,'" the one that they kept in the stalls to fatten. "Bring the fatted calf here and kill it, and let us eat and be merry." So we see that happening over and over, Old and New Testament, that they would kill the fatted calf, a large animal. And what you have to also factor in is that in those times, like for instance with Abraham, he had a huge household. So the calf would not have been used by his 3 guests only. Abraham's household was so large that the Bible tells us when Lot, earlier on in Genesis, was taken as a prisoner of war, Abraham was able to take 318 of his own servants and train them to be like a small army to go and rescue Lot. That's a lot of people to have as part of your household. King Solomon had a huge administration. So what is recorded in 1 Kings 4 there is what his administration would eat daily, as he provided for all of his servants and the people in different regions. He provided it. It was provided from the state, and that's what is being described here. And so too in the New Testament, in Luke chapter 15, the father of the prodigal son was a wealthy man. He had servants and so on who were working for him. So the fatted calf would not have been eaten by the father and the sons alone. It would be the entire household. And as I said earlier, if they knew it was going to be more than enough, they would preserve it with salt or barter it, sell it to somebody else in exchange, or exchange it for some other goods. So they had ways of getting rid of it. It's not going to be eaten by a cow by 2 people or 3 people. That's what was going on there. So keep that in mind. As you see, of course, they couldn't, in ancient times, they didn't have meat markets to go to and say, I want to buy 20 pounds of beef to cook for a feast. No, they had to kill the cow that they were rearing in their own property, and once the cow was killed, they had to make use of the meat as quickly as possible in lieu of freezing it as we would do today. My name is Patrick Antwine. Thank you for the observation and the question. Again, I hope my explanation provided some clarity for you on that issue. So until the next time.